Aaron Renn here. Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Geoffrey Kabaservice. He is the Vice President of Political Studies at the Niskanen Center, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. And he's the author of multiple books. You probably heard me refer to some of them before in my various writings. But one relevant to today's discussion, I think it was his first book. It's called Rule and Ruin: The Downfall of Moderation and the Destruction of the Republican Party from Eisenhower to the Tea Party. That's a mouthful, but I'll give you a sense of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the decline of the moderate Republican, the decline of the moderate Republican tradition. And there's a link to buy that book in the show notes. So, Jeff, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hey, Aaron. Good to be with you.
A colleague of yours that I used to work with one time described you as a Rockefeller Republican. And maybe that's not the best term to use, but is that an accurate description, or kind of how would we describe kind of your own view?
Rockefeller Republican is often the term that's applied to people who dissent from the conservative line within the Republican Party. So that makes a fair amount of sense. But in actual fact, Nelson Rockefeller, who was perceived as the leader of the liberal Republicans in the 50s and 60s, and to some extent into the 70s, actually comes across quite badly in my book. I'm a real critic of Nelson Rockefeller. And I don't identify, never have, as a liberal Republican. I'm more likely to call myself a moderate Republican or some other variety of Republican rather than a Rockefeller.
Would Eisenhower be a better pick?
I definitely identify much more with Dwight Eisenhower. He was much more seen as a representative of moderate republicanism, and that mixture of fiscally conservative and socially tolerant comes a lot closer to where I see myself too.
Yes, I read a biography of Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., which sort of makes the claim that Lodge and this Republican faction basically drafted or twisted Eisenhower's arm to run for president because they didn't want Robert Taft, who was the kind of the arch conservative and a Republican, to become president. But he's an interesting character. What kind of republicanism did a guy like Dwight Eisenhower represent? What are kind of the characteristics of it, and maybe who are some of the key figures or practitioners?
So just to back up a little bit, was that Luke Nichter's biography
Yes.
of Henry Cabot Lodge?
Yeah,
I read that too. It was interesting. Dwight Eisenhower was seen as the great rival of Robert Taft, who you also had mentioned. And that was its own variety of republicanism, Taft republicanism, sometimes called stalwart republicanism. And that was the kind of republicanism that was rooted in the small towns of the Midwest, and in the low church and evangelical Protestant denominations. Typically, people who followed Taft were small businessmen, business people, and they also shared a lot of his Midwestern isolationism and suspicion of Wall Street and the East Coast and foreigners. And Dwight Eisenhower actually had gone to Taft and said, that he was perfectly willing to let Taft run for the nomination for president in 1952, as long as Taft would agree that the United States needed to support NATO and the other emerging aspects of the post-World War II global architecture, and Taft wouldn't do it. So Eisenhower ran against him. And Eisenhower, certainly was different from Taft in his cosmopolitanism, in his belief that the United States had a responsibility to wage the Cold War against the Soviet Union and win, and that this therefore required the United States both to adopt a different attitude towards its engagement with the rest of the world, and also to adopt a different attitude toward government. So Dwight Eisenhower actually was the most fiscally conservative president we've had since then. He balanced the budget 3 times. He shrunk the size of government. He actually reduced debt as a percentage of GNP. And yet he also was willing to undertake the largest public works project still in American history, which was the highway program, and also made serious investments in science and technology and higher education, and actually secondary education too. So Dwight Eisenhower was somebody who his best friends were CEOs, typically the CEOs of whose businesses were located in large cities in both the West Coast and the East Coast, but also the Midwest. And these were people who were temperamentally conservative, but also aware that the United States was a big place. It was changing, and if they lived in cities, they knew that they had to get along with people who didn't always see eye to eye with them and who came from very different backgrounds. So that was essentially what Eisenhower moderation was about.
So sort of internationalism, fiscal conservatism, sort of a general pro-business, pro-investment mindset, maybe good government, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. And, there are still people who fit that description today, and you can certainly find a lot of them around Wall Street. What's actually a little harder to recover nowadays, even in our imagination, is that Taft conservatism. Because, one of the ways that we tend to define conservatism is to think of it as populist versus elitist. And yet Robert Taft was somebody who actually was quite sympathetic to elitism. I mean, he was the son of a U.S. president, but his wife was once asked in the 1950s by a reporter whether she thought of her husband as a common man. And she said, no, not at all. He was first in his class at Yale and first in his class at Harvard Law School. I think it would be wrong to have a common man as a representative for the state of Ohio. And Taft also was not bound by what we regard as a fixed ideology. I mean, he actually did change his mind at several points based on what he saw as his own reading of the evidence. So he actually completely reversed his position, for example, with regard to federal funding of education and also the construction of public housing. And so in that sense, it's actually Taftian conservatism, which is harder to conjure up in the imagination than Eisenhower moderation.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is one that I have always wondered about. The pre-war conservatism, which, you can think of Taft as the guy who sort of was the last representative of that tradition. Maybe you could put like Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. in that and some of these other guys. Was very heavily an elite phenomenon at some level. And it did have some laissez-faire kind of elements that were, may have been adopted by the post-war conservatives that we think of as conservatism. But very interestingly, those guys in there did not seem to be attracted into post-war conservatism. Very few. We've written about the WASPs. Robert Taft was very much kind of a high WASP, one of the great political families of the United States, Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. would definitely have fallen in that as well. But essentially, none of that kind of person was attracted into post-war conservatism at all. And as sort of the pre-war conservative model went away. There were only a few people like the Pews who had their own idiosyncratic personal reasons, some of which came from the oil industry. Their father had been rivals of John D. Rockefeller Sr. in the oil business, had been like a loser. They had like deep burning personal resentments against the Rockefellers. And so I think there was like some like personal animus that even got them in there. What do you think accounts for this break between kind of the Taftian conservatism and maybe the Buckleyite conservatism that came later? Or maybe you disagree about the attraction to the WASP, but many people have noted that the kind of demographic makeup of Buckleyite conservatism was very much on the social margins of America, not sort of the core upper class.
Well, let's talk that through. So just so you know, I worked my way through graduate school while I was getting my history PhD by being a research assistant to Sam Tannenhouse, who was just then starting on his biography of William F. Buckley Jr. And that biography is coming out in June. So this has been a long time coming. Let's just put it that way. And I used to go down to see Buckley in Stamford, Connecticut while I was working on this project and got to know him quite well. Buckley is an interesting character. He really does lead the creation of the modern American conservative movement through the founding of National Review in 1955. And it's done in explicit opposition to Dwight Eisenhower's variety of moderation. But Buckley was very fond of Taft and saw himself in some sense as in the Taftian tradition, even though his forebears came from Texas. He himself was sort of an exotic product of Mexico and Europe and other things like that. But, I think Buckley felt that the Taft tradition had to adjust during the Cold War. Now, Buckley kept that isolationist tradition alive in some sense because he was a devotee of Senator Joseph McCarthy. And Senator Joseph McCarthy, in some sense, was taking revenge on the Eastern WASP establishment for having made the America First movement seem like something that was bad and maybe even treacherous in hindsight. And McCarthy, in the classic populist tradition, was out to do in Harvard and stripy pants diplomats like Dwight Eisenhower and the big banks and all the rest of it, and to accuse them of treason. But the fact is that Buckleyite conservatism, what we often call fusionist conservatism, was a blend of traditionalist, often Catholic rather than Protestant, Christianity, plus libertarianism, which was a sort of strain inherited from the likes of the DuPonts and the Pews in the past, but then also strong anti-communism, which required the acceptance of a bigger government as well as an international role for the United States. But where Buckley always had it in for Dwight Eisenhower was that Republicans had been shut out of the presidency since Franklin Roosevelt had first entered office in 1932, and then had proceeded to pass the New Deal. And Buckley agreed with Taft that the New Deal was unconstitutional, it was authoritarian, it tended toward communism, all the rest of it. And the expectation was that once a Republican president got into office, he would completely uproot the New Deal. And he also would take a much more aggressive stance toward uprooting Soviet communism from its domination of Eastern Europe as well as around the globe. And instead, Eisenhower made peace with the New Deal. He actually built on it in certain respects. He gave rise to what we call the New Deal political order, which held until it was supplanted by the neoliberal order. And then Dwight Eisenhower pursued a policy of containment of Soviet expansionism rather than rollback, which is what the conservatives wanted. So those were some of the tension lines between Buckleyite conservatism, Taftite conservatism, and Eisenhower moderation. When it comes to Rockefeller liberalism, on the other hand, Rockefeller liberal republicanism, Buckley just wanted nothing to do with that. He thought those people were Democrats in disguise, and he wanted them out. And in fact, most of those Rockefeller Republicans did end up becoming Democrats because they were just in the Republican Party for reasons of ancestry. A lot of their forebears had fought on the Union side during the Civil War, and also because they opposed Jim Crow segregation in the South and corruption in the big cities in the East, and those were all Democratic enterprises. But nonetheless, Rockefeller was a big enthusiast for big government, high taxation, high spending, much of what we associate with liberals.
Right. I want to get into the kind of the conservative kind of takeover of the Republican Party, but I want to know. So you would distinguish between the moderate tradition of republicanism and liberal republicanism. Those are two different things in your view?
I think they were different things, yes.
And who is some other moderates besides Eisenhower?
Most people you're talking about who came to prominence in that era were moderates. One thinks, for example, of Charles Percy, who was a senator from Illinois in that period. George Romney, father of Mitt, who was governor of Michigan, and somebody who actually would have been the anti-war candidate in 1968 if he had gained the Republican nomination. To use somebody who actually was not a politician but was sort of associated with this, Paul Hoffman had been the head of the Studebaker Auto Company, and he founded the Committee on Economic Development to be a counterpart to the National Association of Manufacturers, which was seen as a reactionary of business leaders. And the CED's project was both to ensure that the United States didn't slip into depression after World War II, but also, in some sense, to boost the wages of working Americans so that they could buoy the American economy. And that meant that he was relatively friendly toward labor unions, very friendly towards global trade, and then all of the things that the United States did to undergird that global order. So moderation, in many ways, seemed to be the ruling order within the Republican Party throughout the 1950s. And the smallest of those factions in the Republican Party in 1960 was actually the conservatives. And the idea that they would have actually come to complete and utter dominance over the party and expelled every other faction just would have seemed like bizarre science fiction in 1960.
Right. So you said basically the moderates were the dominant faction. The liberals were kind of there as well, but then it was where the conservatives were very small in it. Were there any other groups? Because like political parties were very different then. They were sort of groups of very heterogeneous people, much more so than today. I'm trying to get a landscape of what the Republican Party looked like in the 1950s.
Well, your previous guest, Matt Continetti, made a good observation about Republican, I guess, identification prior to, let's say, the 1960s, which is that most people thought of themselves as just Americans. And then if they thought of themselves as Republicans, they didn't really think of themselves in terms of these factional descriptions that I'm talking about. What they probably would have identified with much more was their geographical location, and to some extent their ancestry, I guess. And so that meant that people out in the Pacific Northwest actually would very much have identified with the pilgrim settlers who came west bearing with them their New England ideals, and that was why they saw themselves as progressive Republicans. On the other hand, the Midwesterners, like Taft and people in that lineage, would have seen themselves in the tradition of the Underground Railroad, which often passed through their districts, and that made them pro-civil rights in a way that maybe you wouldn't expect. But generally speaking, I think it was just all much more confused and, less clear than we like to think when we're putting these labels on them well after the fact.
Mm-hmm. So this is the party, and then kind of what happens? How do the kind of conservatives take over? You mentioned that the conservatives take over the party, and if you read the histories of conservatism, it's usually kind of a little bit of a heroic narrative of how this ragtag group of this remnant or whatever they would have described themselves, went from the total margins of political power to essentially total hegemony over the Republican Party. You view it as a decline story. So I'm interested, like, why I want to get a little bit of a sense of the history of kind of like how this took place, but also like, why do you think it's been so bad that that kind of conservative, the conservative movement took over the Republican Party? I think many conservatives would say, look, Ronald Reagan was a conservative. He was a great president. He defeated communism. What did that do, in a sense, that you think is so bad?
So let me say, I don't, number one, think conservatism is so bad. And, I've seen you over the years at some of the NatCon conferences, and, I find those much more interesting than I do academic conferences, right? Because academic conferences are completely monolithic in terms of their intellectual and political orientation, and they're boring, you know what everyone's going to say before they say it. Whereas the right, for the last several years, has actually been a place of real intellectual experimentation and independent thinkers and voices coming up in a way that just doesn't happen on the academic left. And by the same token, it's not that I think that conservatism is always bad and moderation is always good. It's rather that I see them as representatives of populism and elitism, which are two fraternal twins that hate each other but need each other, right? And there always has to be a balance between them, because when elitism is too much in control, it becomes technocracy. And when populism is too much in control, it becomes zealotry. So in that sense, you could argue that what the Republican Party did need in 1960 was the kind of shakeup that the moderates couldn't deliver. Because while it's true that Eisenhower had won 2 presidential terms, resoundingly, and Richard Nixon almost won the presidency in 1960, maybe did win it legitimately,
Right.
who knows. The fact is that the Republicans had largely been shut out of Congress since the Roosevelt years, right? And that time in the wilderness was to continue through up until 1994 and the Newt Gingrich election. So part of what the Republicans were saying was, we're a party in, part of what the conservatives were saying is, we're a party in secular decline. And we cannot change that as long as the moderates are in control. We have to do something radical. Moderates don't like radicalism. but sometimes that makes them captive of a status quo, even if it's a negative status quo. And so what the conservatives were doing around Barry Goldwater, for example, was looking to break the Democratic Party's hold, particularly over the Solid South, right? Because of the legacy of the Civil War, Democrats were in control of every party in the old every state in the old Confederacy. And it was essentially one-party rule. And as long as the Democrats had that advantage, it was very difficult to displace them in the majority, both in the presidency as well as in the Congress. Now, Dwight Eisenhower actually did make significant inroads into this old Solid South in the presidential elections of 52 and 56. But largely, even the conservatives, Democrats, continued to vote Democratic. And so part of what people like William Rusher was saying was that, if we offer a conservative alternative, we can wean those Solid South Democrats away from their ancestral loyalties, and that will make us the majority party. The problem is that this actually requires the Republican Party to abandon its support for civil rights, because the Democratic Party at that point in the South was the party of Jim Crow and segregation. So this was a real ideological and even moral dispute between the moderates and the conservatives in that period. And of course, I side with the moderates in that. But nonetheless, the conservatives were correct to say that something needed to change, and that there needed to be a way paved toward a kind of president like Ronald Reagan, who could both be a conservative, in some measure a populist, but also resoundingly popular. So, the conservative story is one of triumph, right? Because Barry Goldwater was the St. John the Baptist, paving the way for Ronald Reagan, who I guess in that scenario is Christ, but let's not get too theological here. But the point is that, Ronald Reagan would not have happened had it not been for conservatives taking over much of the Republican Party mechanism in 1964, and arguably that is a good thing.
Yeah. So what? So in essence, conservatism, pure unalloyed conservatism, is too populist and can't really effectively govern. I think that's the case. I've always said that I think the loss of those kind of moderate to liberal Republicans is sort of like ballast in the ship, and if you don't, and it's sort of like one party rule. If you don't have, if you just have one party rule or one faction rule, it generally goes badly eventually, no matter what the faction is. You have, having to actually work with other people to get things done. It imposes a certain discipline on you that keeps you from going off into the ditch sometimes. It has its problems, but I feel like we can certainly feel, just as we sort of, I think, keenly feel the loss of that WASP tradition, whatever its flaws. We feel the loss of that moderate to liberal Republican tradition as well.
Yeah, I think we are aligned on this to some extent, and I think, again, part of the underappreciated genius of Ronald Reagan was that he was the conservative leader who could hold the loyalty of his followers while also maintaining the Republican Party as a big tent. And on a few occasions, he did say to the conservatives publicly, look, this is a big tent. It's a great party here under this tent, but it is not your job to tear down the tent or to kick other people in this tent out of our party. And the conservatives did not like that, because there's almost nothing that the true conservative hates more than a moderate, right? It's an uncanny valley sort of thing. They look like a moderate, but they sound like a Democrat in the conservatives' view. But Ronald Reagan convinced them that this was the path toward victory and indeed dominance. And he succeeded, but his successors could not maintain that balance.
Would you consider George Herbert Walker Bush a moderate, or did he have to embrace? He originally, was elected calling, Reaganomics voodoo economics and all of that stuff he was running, and he was a critic of Reagan. I think originally he was a CIA man, so he would have been very kind of establishment-y. Where do you place him?
I think George H.W. Bush, in his heart, considered himself a moderate, in the same way that his father, Prescott Bush, the senator from Connecticut, was a moderate. But he understood that to get ahead in the Republican Party, you had to adopt at least some coloration of conservatism. And for that reason, he actually, when he was running for the House in Texas, ran against the '64 Civil Rights Act, although he later repented of that. I think very few of his conservative conversions were all that sincere, or were perceived as all that sincere, which is why he actually could not maintain the loyalty of Reagan's followers, even when he was Reagan's more or less anointed heir. But on the other hand, I also think that George W. Bush saw his responsibility as bringing to a peaceful conclusion the Cold War. And he did that magnificently. And so I think, his legacy in that sense is secure.
Yeah. So I don't know that we need to go through the entire history of like the conservative takeover, which I think a lot of people are somewhat familiar with. But we're in the 80s now, and we have this conservative president, Reagan. Who are the moderates in the 1980s? Who would you consider who are still part of the Republican Party?
Well, I think moderate is a term that had fallen out of favor by the 80s. And there are serious problems with the term moderate, right? It can mean somebody who's just willing to compromise, no matter what the issue is. And moderation, to some extent, is also in danger of being defined by whatever the extremes are, which means that it isn't a fixed position, and that's an uncomfortable place to be in politics. Nonetheless, you can certainly point to a lot of moderates and their good and bad qualities in the Republican Party still under Ronald Reagan. Certainly James Baker, Reagan's first chief of staff, was a moderate. So too was Howard Baker, the senator from Tennessee who came into the administration. To put it a bit closer to your home, Richard Lugar was somebody who had come up through politics as the Republican mayor of Indianapolis and then became a senator. Over time, I think he showed some of the liabilities of moderation. And in particular, the fact that moderates often aren't able to raise a fire in their followers because they get too comfortable with their position in power and with foreign policy instead of domestic policy and living inside the Beltway instead of living back in the district. There are certainly problems that came with that. But, keep in mind also that one of Lugar's great proteges was Mitch Daniels. Now, is Mitch Daniels a moderate? He wouldn't call himself a moderate, but he's somebody who, like the moderates, has always believed in civility, in negotiation, in pragmatism, in fiscal conservatism, and also in effective institutions. So is that the continuation of the moderate Republican tradition in Indiana? I don't know. You'd actually be in a better position to say that than I would.
Yeah. So how did we essentially see the disappearance? How did the moderates essentially disappear? Or these kinds of people disappear out of the Republican Party? It seemed like there used to be, if nothing, a lot of senators who you would say were, moderate. People, they would call them liberals. I don't know if you call them a liberal. Maybe John Danforth from Missouri might have been in that category. Olympia Snow. There were different ones. Maybe you'd even put Mitt Romney in there. But it just seems like slowly over time, those people all went away. Certainly, some of the old Northeastern Republicans, like Lincoln Chafee, became a Democrat. So they left. How was it that after you have this sort of high with Reagan, that these kind of moderate traditions sort of disappeared in essence?
Well, some of the moderates just got old and retired, and they didn't have successors who identified themselves in that same tradition. But I think that a large part of it in that period also was that Democrats were ceasing to be a divided party, right? Democrats purged, in effect, the conservatives from their ranks during that time. And that meant that the former segregationists, or just people who saw the world in much more socially conservative terms, in the South and West especially, moved over into the Republican Party. And in particular, it was evangelical Christians who provided the grassroots popular base for Republicanism that had been missing all along. It's true that Jimmy Carter was probably the first to bring evangelical Christians back into politics after their long self-imposed exile since the 1920s, arguably. But certainly Reagan won their loyalty, and they became, an invaluable path to power for conservative Republicans. And that allowed them to unseat many of the moderates in the primary contests, which prior to that time hadn't been seen as all that important. And some of the more, Taft-aligned Republicans like Ray Bliss, who was the head of the RNC and still seen as one of the great ones, really actively repressed primary challenges in the interest of maintaining a big tent. So that began to change. Um, and then I think, the end of the Cold War also uh, had a real impact on both the conservative ranks, but also the Republican Party, giving people who'd at least had that as a bond of commonality one less thing to see each other as being on the same side. And then you also have to point to the figure of Newt Gingrich, who offered Republicans a path back to power. And it's often forgotten, but it was moderate Republicans who put him over the top, first in his election as Republican whip in the House, and then as the House minority leader. And that allowed him to become Speaker. But Gingrich brought a much more ideological conception to the Republican Party. He no longer actually obeyed seniority. It became ideological litmus tests as to who got ahead in the committees. And Gingrich was also, most importantly, an anti-institutionalist. He saw the path to Republican dominance as blowing up the popular faith in Congress and the democratic tradition of governance. And he got his wish, but it came at a significant cost, and that was a large part of why the moderates started to see themselves as no longer aligned with the Republican Party.
Where does a movement like the Tea Party come in?
We both lived through the Tea Party, right? So I have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, it began as a movement of fiscal conservatism. And I was actually in favor of that, and some people who identified with this moderate tradition thought that this would actually probably be a good thing if you believe that our deficits are ultimately unsustainable. However, the Tea Party movement was itself kind of a resurgence of grassroots activism, which initially was directed against moderates because that's who they could get at. And Tea Party probably had its biggest impact in those Republican primaries that unseated the remaining moderates. And the Tea Party ultimately, I think, was not 100% committed to the cause of fiscal moderation so much as it was committed to partisanship and polarization. And this just further widened the division with moderates.
Yeah, and it does seem to me that the Tea Party, and you can see this for a long time, this populist discontent that is a recurring feature of American life. It came up in the maybe the very late 80s and the early 90s. There was a huge wave of populist discontent over manufacturing decline and trade and immigration. You can think about Ross Perot or Pat Buchanan and those guys. And then the Tea Party is sort of another manifestation of it. And then you could think of Trumpism as kind of the current incarnation of it. Do you think that there were like legitimate grievances behind some of these movements, that these things were not being addressed by the parties, quite apart from whether populist ideas were any good? Were they getting at legitimate problems or things that maybe some of the establishment or even moderate people had just disregarded?
Absolutely. And I would recommend to one and all your podcast interview with Tanner Greer, which surfaced a lot of these issues. Immigration was an issue where the establishments of both parties had agreed to put it off the table. But the fact is that when you have what is perceived as uncontrolled immigration to levels that are previously unknown in most people's lifetime, that's going to spark some kind of reaction. And we've seen that around the globe. And you have to chalk up the rise of populism to establishment inattention. The fact that elites maybe were just insulated from the consequences of high levels of immigration and therefore discounted it as an issue. I think elites also discounted the deindustrialization of large swaths of America, the rise of these left behind post-industrial smaller cities and towns and rural areas. And, as Tanner also pointed out, the opioid epidemic was something that the media couldn't be bothered to report on, even though you're having, body counts across America on a level with the entirety of the Vietnam War each year. Because these are not people in the sphere where media pays attention to what's going on. And these are part of, a group that liberals discount. They simply don't care about them to that extent. And that meant that the most incisive and powerful piece on the opioid epidemic that appeared was not in one of the mainstream publications. It was in First Things by Christopher Caldwell. So, this is a case where the balance between the elite and the populists had swung too far to the elites. Populism was a necessary corrective in that sense. But, of course, populism can swing too far as well.
one reason I bring that up is there actually a political market for what you think of as moderate governance? Because I asked, because I would say Mitt Romney was kind of a moderate guy. Maybe you disagree, but he was, to me, he was like the face of it. He's like, oh, I was an effective governor of Massachusetts. I saved the Olympics. I was like a good, I was successful in business. Look at my family. It's perfect. Like, he's like, I'm the guy that can govern. I'm Mr. Electable in a sense. I'm the electable face of the Republican Party. But he didn't get elected, right? And he didn't really come close to getting elected, and there didn't even seem to be much enthusiasm for him within the Republican Party. He was sort of next in line. In a sense, does anybody want that in America today?
Well, let's do a hypothetical here. If you could go to Democrats who believe that Trump's second term is the coming of the apocalypse and ask them, if you could go back in time to 2012, would you vote for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney? And the answer you would get from an awful lot of them is that they would vote for Mitt Romney. Because if Romney had won that election, then populism would have been somewhat more repressed, shall we say, within the Republican Party than it subsequently became. How far Romney would have gone toward populism, that's an unknowable question. But the fact is that Romney's loss is what made the populist case for the fact that we can't keep nominating these moderates because they lose. Look at what happened to Romney. Look at what happened to John McCain.
Right.
So, yeah, I think
even Bob Dole wasn't that conservative.
Bob Dole was much more in the Taft tradition, right? He was not a sort of classic Barry Goldwater style conservative.
Yeah. And I think it's there. Like, I think a lot of times, there's some of this revisionist history by the left. I think, the reality is no matter who's running in 2028, they're all going to vote for the Democrat, no matter who it is. I mean, that's just the reality. I don't, that is part of the issue is that we're so polarized. There are so few swing voters that it creates a situation where these moderates with crossover appeal don't really have any, because there's no crossover appeal anymore. Maybe Obama was the last person that had crossover appeal. He won the state of Indiana even, which is tough. But I feel like, you could dominate. I think it's easy to talk about in retrospect 2012, but I think prospectively, there just aren't very many people who are looking for, I'll vote for that guy regardless of their political party. Maybe I'm off on that, but that's kind of how I view it.
Well, I mean, I do think that we've been in this, 4-decade-long period of intense partisanship, which is both deep and narrow. And that's unusual in the broad sweep of American history. Usually you have what used to be referred to as the Sun Party, which wins big majorities and really acquires something like an American consensus, and then the Moon Party that's in its shadow. And that certainly was the case for Republicans for most of the first decades of their existence following the Civil War. And it certainly was true of FDR and the Democrats following the New Deal. And it looked like that was going to be the case for Ronald Reagan after his great victories in the 80s. But really what you've had is just stagnation and stalemate for the last several decades, where neither party wins a durable majority in the presidency or in either house of Congress. And that means that they can't actually pass their program because, again, cross-party alliances are sort of a thing of the past at this point. And, people like me are going to be out there saying to both Democrats and Republicans, you actually might get one of those big majorities back if you actually were willing to move more toward the center. But of course, that would diminish the enthusiasms of your most partisan, zealous followers at the extremes, and that might actually cost you the election too. So I'm not sure. It would be great to say that there should be a charismatic moderate who can stir the grassroots while retaining the loyalties of the elite, but I'm not sure how you create that person.
Yeah. And you kind of got at this earlier. One of the things that really strikes me is that there don't seem to be any kind of moderates that you would actually want to vote for because they would be like great at governance. There was a guy back in the day in Indiana named J. Irwin Miller. And maybe you would think I don't know if you'd call him liberal or call him moderate, but he was the CEO of Cummins Engine, again, a total blue blood guy. massive investor in his town, and sort of as a result of his leadership, his town, Columbus, Indiana, is basically the only Rust Belt city that never rusted. It's a manufacturing city that never went downhill. It just kept going. And the Esquire magazine did a huge cover story on him in like 1967. This is the guy who ought to be the next president of the United States. You hear him talk, and everything he says makes total sense. Again, hugely successful in business, hugely successful civically in many things that he did. I think about Richard Lugar. Then you mentioned Richard Lugar. When he was on the school board in Indianapolis, maybe when he was like 30 years old, he convinced them to start taking federal money for like school lunches, which they didn't do. Then he became mayor in his 30s. He pushed through a big reorganization of city government, a city-county merger. He became a senator, and he was, known as this like foreign policy guy. And there was this whole thing he did with Sam Nunn to secure all the Soviet nuclear materials, and like. But then you think about like, well, what happened to that guy? Like, after the Nunn-Lugar thing, like, did he ever do anything? And as you say, he didn't even have a house in Indiana. He was voting from it came out when somebody primaried him that he was voting from the address of a house he'd sold 30 years ago. He was living in Virginia. He became a little contemptuous of the voters. And that's one of the things you see of all these moderate types today. Their total contempt for the voters of the Republican Party, that even Mitch Daniels is sort of like, he's not going to get back into politics because he just took this explicitly anti-Trump thing and started going that. Or you can think about the early 90s. There were all these incredible Republican, kind of moderate Republican mayors like Rudy Giuliani in New York or Steve Goldsmith in Indianapolis who were really accomplishing great things in governance. I look at Rudy Giuliani today, like what happened? And so I don't see like this great cadre of people that you're like, you would put these guys in charge of something because they're really going to deliver. Mitt Romney might be the last guy. I don't even think we have a competent institutional people of this moderate tradition today to even put in it. Call me crazy. I don't know how you feel. I don't know how you feel that way, but like, I don't see that there are any great moderate people that strike me as great institutional leaders.
So let's talk about J. Irwin Miller, because I knew him quite well. I actually visited him at his home in Columbus, Indiana.
It's a great house. It's a museum now. You should check it out. One of the great works of modern architecture, if no one's ever gone there. Incredible.
It's great. It was, Irwin had a real fondness for modern architecture, and he brought the world's greatest architects of that period to Columbus to build the firehouse, or the library. But he also had a fondness for Victorian architecture, and he restored the Main Street, for example. And he also had Edward Hicks' The Peaceable Kingdom hanging up in his dining room. And Irwin was just, an incredible human being. He could read the New Testament in its original Greek. He could play on his Stradivarius violin. There aren't too many people like that who come along ever. But, part of what really distinguished Irwin as a political thinker was that his emphasis was on the long term. And you had to think about doing now what was going to be beneficial to the United States 100 years from now. And short-termism is what rules nowadays in every aspect of American life, whether it be business or politics. And in that sense, someone like Irwin is very much out of place. But, let's take another example. There's the Carmel, Indiana family of the Ruckelshouses, right?
Yeah.
And, William Ruckelshaus is the one that people know about because he was Deputy Attorney General to Elliot Richardson, another classic moderate Republican, who was the one who chose to resign rather than go along with Nixon during the Saturday Night Massacre, right? Mm-hmm. And, the Ruckelshouses are still pillars of the community in Columbus, Indiana, and as far as I know, they're still moderate Republicans. Whether they have
there was one that was a state senator, and he got defeated by the Democrats, by like some liberal Democrat up here. Like, I think those guys are not. They're kind of on the outs.
The times are not propitious. The times are not propitious for moderate Republicans, and I'm not going to pretend that they are.
That's one of the things that's happened is guys like that actually have not even been primaried out. They've been picked off by Democrats in these kind of demographically changing districts, and now there are very liberal Democrats representing some of those districts.
Well, it's some of both, and here we get into, what is one of the big, real structural changes in American political life, which you know so well, which is the diploma divide, right? I mean, when George H.W. Bush was running for re-election, he won a majority of college-educated voters. while Bill Clinton won something like 2/3 of non-college educated, blue-collar, white voters. And now those percentages have flipped for both parties. Democrats are overwhelmingly the party of the college-educated. Republicans are overwhelmingly the party of the working class, and not just the white working class, but the multiracial, multi-ethnic working class. And, that causes a problem for people who are more in that elite mold, who are getting educated at the Harvards and Princetons and Yales of the world, and maybe then they're coming back to their district, but they're not really in sync with where the working class is, and that makes them challenging to put forward as Republican candidates. But let me ask you, as long as I've got you on the line here, about something that bothers me. Let me tell you about my Harvard problem and yours.
Okay.
Harvard right now has come under significant attack from the Trump administration. And the Trump administration sent Harvard a letter saying that it must comply with these changes in admissions and faculty hiring and student discipline to remove the stain of anti-Semitism from the Harvard campus, which is very real. But Harvard could not comply with that and still be what is considered to be an independent university, and so they refused. So the Trump administration has put frozen $2.2 billion worth of funds for Harvard. It's looking into getting its accreditation removed, as well as its tax-exempt status. And this seems to me to present an issue that lines up with your idea borrowed from Albert Hirschman about voice and exit. What do you do about Harvard? And one course being pursued by the Trump administration is to say there's no reforming Harvard. You've got to delegitimize it and defund it and destroy it. There's also the view of, let's say, the people at the University of Austin in Texas, which is like, you can't reform Harvard, but you can create an alternative Harvard here in the Southwest. And then there's the position of Robert George, who you had on recently, which is that you can actually create institutions within these institutions, which are focused on civic education, which are in effect counter-programming the monolithic leftness and extremism of the faculty, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. And I'm curious to know how you weigh all of these factors nowadays, and how you think people in your circles.
That's a very good. That's a very good question. I don't know. I'm not too familiar with Harvard. I did not go to Harvard. I'm a state school product. I went to Indiana University, but when I look at Harvard and Yale, and to me, they look like they've been very strategic over the years in keeping the Republican Party at bay by ensuring that the children of prominent Republicans are able to attend there. And you often find that, the children of this person got into Yale Law School, or they, and it's not all Republicans either. So the former senator, Democratic senator from Indiana, Evan Bayh, 2 sons, they both went to Harvard. And so I think it's actually, my understanding is, you may even get a little bit of affirmative action if you're a conservative going to Harvard Law School. They want the conservative elites to have degrees from these places. And in fact, there are quite a few elite education products in senior positions in the Trump administration. He himself went to Wharton, J.D. Vance went to Yale Law, Pete Hegseth went to Princeton, I think, maybe, and then maybe to get a graduate degree from Harvard. So there are quite a few of these people who have degrees from these elite institutions, and maybe even the Republicans are over-indexed to some extent on the elite institutions. But this hasn't necessarily protected them under Trump for whatever reason. And I do think the truth is they overplayed their hand in the last 5 years with, believe me, conservatives know what happened to Charles Murray at Middlebury College, and they saw the BLM riots that were essentially approved of, not just by, all the institutions, but also like the public health establishment, and they're taking a look at these institutions and they're saying, okay, what's going on here, people? And so I think there's less protection of the institutions than there used to be. But I think that really is our dilemma. We need institutions. It's not obvious how to reform institutions. And I think, therefore, it leads a lot of people, and I call it the prisoner's dilemma. the prisoner's dilemma, you always defect, even though cooperating is theoretically the best move because of the incentives of the game. And I think the way is the incentives of the game are either to exit or kind of go after the institutions. I would like to think there's at least kind of one institution that might try to reinvent itself. I think some of them have nibbled around the edges of that, not in the elite institutions. I think Mitch Daniels at Purdue University did a pretty good job on like addressing tuition issues and quite a few issues. While as he did, he skirted the cultural issues. He just sort of said, "We're going to be free speech. We're not going to allow anybody to suppress speech." But he didn't let the crazies go wild, but he didn't really push back on anything culturally, just as he never did in government at all. Is the idea about truth. I think Arizona State, the guy who's the president of Arizona State, super entrepreneurial, super like, we're going to be the economic engine here. We're going to provide opportunity for people. So I think there are some people doing interesting things, but not dealing with some of the key cultural issues. I think it's very interesting. I do think it's very, very hard to, all but impossible. I don't think the University of Austin at Texas is going to become a new Harvard. I don't think you can. I think creating a new Harvard is very difficult. The only guy I think who really thought long and hard about how to solve that problem was Peter Thiel with the Thiel Fellowship, where in essence, you sort of get into college, maybe a little bit you get into college first, then you drop out of college, and it's harder to get into the Thiel Fellowship than it is to get into Harvard. So it's a real credential. It created an elite credential around it. It created a network. And there was so much success for those people, in untold billions of dollars in businesses created, that it became an extraordinarily prestigious way. So he did create an alternative path through the Thiel Fellowship. But I think in general, I think it's going to be very difficult for UATX to pull that off. So I don't know. I was kind of hoping. See, I'm like, why doesn't our society produce J. Irwin Millers anymore? And I do think the loss of the WASP tradition is the end of guys like that, because he was cultivated from an early age through all those things. But then how do we create structural incentives for good governance? It just doesn't. I see pockets of it here and there. The mayor of Carmel, Indiana, that I tout all the time, Jim Brainerd, it's like 7-term mayor, total transformed the city, very much in the moderate tradition, enormously successful. If somebody like that had run state government for the last 28 years, like he was mayor for 28 years, this place would be like Oz, it would be like completely redone. It's incredible. But we don't have, those guys are so rare now. It's like, I think there's a human capital development problem. For one thing, I think there's a big human capital development problem. And I think there are big institutional problems with institutional problems. We wouldn't even promote those people. I think the sort of DEI concept, which is deeply, deeply embedded into American institutional life, is basically toxic to good leadership. So I don't know. I think it's very difficult. I was hoping you had some answers. Like, how would we get a guy like a J. Irwin Miller or like old school Richard Lugar, people that even if you didn't agree with everything on everything, I like Mike Bloomberg as mayor of New York. Whether he's a Republican, is debatable. He's probably a Democrat, I would say. But at the end of the day, like a guy like that who just figured out, I'm going to run this thing, and we're going to make some big changes here and get it right. I mean, there's so few individuals, and then I'm not sure. People think about, we need to get rid of primaries and go back to smoke-filled rooms. That doesn't work either. Like in Indiana, and I think in other states, some of our statewide offices are not selected through a primary. They're selected through a state convention, and it's selected for some of the lowest grade candidates we've ever had. So just putting it back in charge of party insiders is not a solution. It's sort of like, I don't know what the reforms are. I'm always interested in that's why I like Yuval Levin. He's trying to think about how can we turn the dials in Congress to get things a little better, but it doesn't look very hopeful, honestly. I think we do need an institutional reset, but we don't have an FDR or somebody like that, or an Eisenhower, who's an expert in running large scale organizations and even know what they were doing.
Well, while you could to some extent foresee Eisenhower as somebody who would do a good job in the presidency because he had run the U.S. military and the Allied invasion of Normandy, among other things, Franklin D. Roosevelt was not Franklin D. Roosevelt until after he'd had his encounter with polio. And that set him on a very different life course than he would have had otherwise. You can't necessarily tell where leaders are going to come from, but you can maybe do something to make it likelier that they will appear. And, I remember on one of your episodes, you had referenced Rusty Reno's essay on Kingman Brewster. And Kingman Brewster was the subject of my first book, The President of Yale, during the 1960s. And, the Rusty argument, which has some validity, is that these WASP moderate Republicans sowed the seeds of their own destruction, because Kingman Brewster, in effect, overthrew the old WASP aristocracy that had dominated institutions like Yale, brought in a meritocracy, but this actually eventually hardened into its own aristocracy, but without the sense of WASP conscience and self-restraint and modesty and all the rest of it that we missed about the best of the old WASP tradition.
And in my view, when I read it, I mean, the guy essentially disinherited his own children, in a sense. He had a bunch of kids. He was the 11th generation descendant of William Brewster. He's the president of Yale, but there will never be another Brewster, probably another prominent Brewster in public life again.
I don't know.
Certainly not from his lineage.
I know Kingman's kids, and Jordana Brewster is actually one of the most
she's like an
prominent
actress
American
or something, right?
actresses now. So, they're moving into different areas. I think the better example actually is Paul Moore, who was the Episcopal Bishop of first Washington and then New York, had 9 kids to Brewster's 5, and none of those 9 kids followed him into any form of Christianity at all. They all drifted into essentially left-wing politics, sort of as Jody Bottom had diagnosed had happened to the mainstream Protestant denominations. But, I think there's an opening. Let's put it that way. I'm not going to tell you that conservatives should try to go up through the humanities faculty, because my own experience shows that you can be top of your class and you can write a great dissertation that they'll never consider you anywhere. They are just simply too set against people who are right of center and don't fit the desired demographics. But you can actually appeal to smart young people coming out of good education programs all over the country, not just at the Ivy Leagues, and say, look, we're looking at a bad future here. You young people are super dispirited and you have reasons to be. Like, even the mating system is broken in this country. And you're facing, under Democrats, stasis and decline, and you may not like what Trump or Musk are doing, but at least they're shaking things up, and they're probably going to break things in the process, but, stasis didn't seem to be an option. What if you considered a different path from the usual thing that you're being pressured to do? What if you actually went back to the middle of the country? What if you actually tried to rebuild some of these areas in ways that, you're not preaching to people about how they should be. You're just trying to offer them a better option. And you're trying to work with them rather than tell them what to do. I can really see a kind of opportunity for that kind of evangelism, which I actually thought J.D. Vance was going to be the prophet of once upon a time. And maybe he will be again someday, but the question about what the Republican Party is going to become has to wait on what Trump 2.0 will become, whether it will succeed even according to its own goals or whether it will fail. And I don't think we can know what the path forward is until we have a better sense of that.
Yeah, I think somewhat, here's kind of my view, is that it has to be at the individual level that people make choices to do something better. And maybe you won't get to be head of an institution, but you can at least chart a different path of integrity of yourself. The one thing that struck me about some of these guys that you featured in the book, Brewster would be one. Henry Cabot Lodge was another one. Brewster, I don't remember the details, but by the end of his life, he wasn't in great financial shape, was my impression. And I think it was Henry Cabot Lodge by the end of his life was sort of selling off artwork to raise funds. Or maybe that was Brewster. One of those guys, they both frittered away their money in public service, in a sense. And
Nelson Rockefeller did too.
John Lindsay was so broke, Rudy Giuliani had to give him a job so he could get health insurance. I mean, he essentially went bankrupt. And you talked about today, of course, Republicans tend to think of Lindsay as this horrible mayor of New York who didn't plow the streets in a blizzard or something. I think there was a revisionist history of the Lindsay administration you could do. But like guys like that or like Miller that had a certain personal integrity. And like there's nobody who goes into politics today and gets poorer in those kind of positions. Everybody comes out richer. And the idea like I'm going to like I'm going to go into public service and at the end of my lifetime of serving America at the highest levels, my family as fortune is going to have dissipated. Like that's like a formula that doesn't compute. And so I think there's a sense, not that I'm saying people should get poor through public service, but I think that idea of that integrity that people had, that I'm not just here to enrich myself at this thing. I think at the individual level, we can all make that commitment. Not that we're trying to become poor, we're not going to like make an honest dollar, but this idea that we're not just here to like take things out of the system, to grift our way to to riches. That's one thing.
I completely agree. I completely agree. I mean, look, if you actually really ask me how I would define myself, if I had to put a label on it, I would say I'm an American century conservative, right? I mean, I revere the American century that seems like it's now closing, when America sort of reached the apex of global competitiveness through reasons of our own strength and unity, and the fact we had effective institutions, and that we actually weren't so politically divided, and that there was a real patriotism on both sides of the aisle. And in that sense, I completely agree with you that any successful strand of politics has to recover a sense of cause and patriotism. There has to be sacrifice, and there probably have to be martyrs. And we'll see from which quarter of politics this strain might emerge.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think to me, it's I don't know if it's all political. Maybe there will be a person who's well positioned to do something. Again, Mike Bloomberg saw an opportunity. He's like, hey, I got $30 billion. I could become mayor of New York. I can do something. And his he had a advisor, campaign manager named Bradley Tusk, who later became famous as a political fixer for Ubers in other countries. He had a sort of political consulting firm. So it's like, we help your startup get through the regulatory morass and we take equity. And he wrote a book called The Fixer. And he started off as Chuck Schumer's comms director. And he actually worked for Rod Blagojevich, the governor of Illinois, and some other stuff. He made this comment like, Michael Bloomberg is like, this is a little bit of a paraphrase, is the only person I've ever met who didn't get into politics because he has a hole in his heart that he's trying to fill. And there's something like that like at the individual level, just to say, this is how I'm going to live. And then, of course, if there's an opportunity, I think it's there. I think it has to emerge. There has to be a little bit of an organic emergence of something, of people, maybe like a counterculture. I think there is sort of a counterculture, a Saint Benedict, if you will, not necessarily in the Benedict option of the world, but somebody who takes a look around and says, I'm going to do something different here. I think a lot of people have ideas of trying different things, like the Teal Fellowship or different things like that. And eventually, if something successful hits, nothing succeeds like success in America. But I think it has to, and that's one of my projects, is thinking about how these evangelicals, who are essentially just a vote bank for a populist vote bank, can produce people who contribute towards a better leadership in America. Not necessarily in politics, but in other domains. So I don't know. There's a lot to think about. I don't have great solutions, but it's a problem we all need to think about.
On a recent podcast, I had John Rauch on to my Vital Center podcast, and he's written a book called Cross Purposes. And he is himself an atheistic person from Jewish background, but he has great reverence for the Mormons, because it seems to him that it's a religion which is thick in the sense it demands a lot from its adherents. It asks them to make sacrifices. It asks them to show up when they don't want to show up, and to go on missions, and for all the fact that there may be good things that come out of missions, as Tanner said, for most young people, the idea of going 2 years in a foreign country to win maybe not one convert is just a really daunting prospect. But it's the strength of that religion that it demands so much from people, and that people it's not just people's partisanship projected onto God. And it's that sense of cause and devotion and dedication, which I think so many people are missing, the real hole in so many people's souls nowadays. And I think that it is really a chance, maybe this in this really fluid moment when some cause, institution, person, leader can step forward and be that person.
No, we'll see. We'll see. We certainly need it, but, until then, it's going to be like the circus coming to town, as I like to say, and on some of this stuff. Well, I think unless you have any other closing thoughts, we can wrap it up. My guess.
One of the great hymns is by James Russell Lowell. Once to every man and nation, and there is the idea there's some great cause, God's new Messiah, offering each the bloom or blight.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that is what we're being confronted with nowadays, and it's up to us to recognize that.
Yeah. Well, that again, we'll wrap it up. My guest has been Geoff Kabaservice. He is the Vice President of Political Studies at the Niskanen Center, and I will be putting a link to his stuff in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining me, Geoff.
Thanks, Aaron. Pleasure to talk to you.